Hello, I'm Marion Fulker and I'm the CEO of Perth's leading think tank, the Committee for Perth. Welcome to FACTBase Talks, an online series where you get to hear the latest research from our organisation. FACTBase is a long-standing joint venture research program between the Committee for Perth and the University of Western Australia. We are the leaders in delivering tangible research that drives structural, cultural and behaviour change on issues that matter to the people of Greater Perth. To date, the partnership has produced more than 80 pieces of research, creating a knowledge base on issues that affect our region and its future. These include the economy, global competitiveness, transport and mobility, gender equality, and the region's demography and geography, to name but a few. Each of these is available on our website for download free of charge. I trust you find the information and analysis contained in this presentation stimulating and that it adds to your understanding of a complex issue that affects us all.
Thank you, Marion, for the introduction. I'm very excited to have joined the Committee for Perth to lead this timely and topical research project, Race to the Top. Working as an economist in both academia and policy, it's been a rewarding experience to delve into the data to understand why WA faces the current skill shortages. In this, the first of three bulletins, I examine the immediate challenges in the labour market. Just to give you a brief outline of Race to the Top projects, what do we know are the important issues facing the state's workforce? First and foremost, the committee's Future of Work found that skilled people are WA's most valuable resources, but they are diminishing in supply, with Greater Perth human capital diminishing compared with other major capital cities. This is a main concern, hence a specific focus on this issue in this project. The COVID pandemic has shown that access to workers is essential, yet this is one of the biggest challenges facing many WA businesses. The Race to the Top project will examine labour market issues that are front and centre of businesses' concern, by focusing on current and future workforce needs, and ultimately will result in a report that will outline how to prepare for future skill demand. Now, you'll be aware that there's a lot of data floating around. My research brings together data from different sources, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Department of Home Affairs, National Skills Commission, National Centre for Vocational Education Research, and quality indicators for learning and teaching to provide you with a comprehensive picture of WA and Greater Perth workforce challenges and solutions. Now let's get stuck into FACTBase 78. We all know that international and WA border restrictions have reduced employers' access to workers. With increased economic activity, this has created labour and skill shortages. This bulletin will focus on two things. Firstly, the immediate to short-term demand. I'm looking at the last 6 months by occupation and skill level. A longer-term trend is also provided. In terms of labour supply, this bulletin reviews the different sources, namely domestic and overseas, in addition to identifying latent labour supply that can potentially be accessed. Labour demand, as you can see, I've given you two examples of labour demand over the past 11 years here. For technician and trades worker occupations, the left-hand side graph, and community and service workers occupations, the right-hand side graphs. These two occupations are selected because they've shown strong demand growth across major cities, but in the bulletin itself, I have covered all 8 broad occupation categories. So overall, these graphs show intense competition for workers in these occupations across major capital cities, and there's also underlying growth over time. For example, if you look at the left-hand side graph, we can see that the demand for technicians and trade workers in Perth has increased by more than 100% over the past 11 years. That's the purple line. Since May 2020, the demand for these workers for Perth has outstripped that of other major cities. If I can now draw your attention to the right-hand side graph, you can see that demand for community and personal service workers in Perth has increased by around 150% over the last 11 years. Since May 2020, the graph shows the demand for Perth has been very strong compared with other major cities. If you remember early on, I mentioned the importance of human capital. What I've shown you here is the relationship between demand for workers and qualifications required as measured by skill level 1, the left-hand side graph, and skill level 3, the right-hand side graph for jobs. These two skills levels are selected because they show strong growth in demand over the past 15 years, not only in WA, but across other states. So looking at the left-hand side graph, skill level 1 is commensurate with a bachelor's degree or higher qualification. This typically includes managerial and professional occupations. What we can see is for WA, the demand for workers in these occupations exceeded that in other states during the last resources boom, and since May 2020, again, the purple line on the left-hand side, and over the past 15 years, the demand for these workers have grown by more than 60% for WA. Skill level 3 is commensurate with a certificate 3 or 4, and this typically includes technicians and trades, as well as community and personal service occupations. The demand for workers in these occupations in WA have far exceeded that in other states. Over the past 15 years, the demand for these workers have grown close to around 150%. Therefore, the data reinforces the importance of having access to skilled workers for the future. With regard to the skill composition of WA workforce, as measured here in the graph by the proportion of 20 to 64 years old with a certificate 3 or above, WA sits somewhere in the middle of the pack. We're ranked below the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria in the proportion of working age with a certificate 3 or above in 2020. The disparity between those who are highly educated and those who are not can have lasting labour market effects, such as employability and future earnings potentials. In summary, the data show that demand for workers in Perth and WA have been strong over the past decade, particularly in certain occupations and for workers with certain qualifications. Since COVID, the competition for workers has been intense across major capital cities and states. I've given you a picture of what's happening on the demand side. I'd like to turn your attention now to the supply side, with a focus firstly on domestic labour supply. The left-hand side graph shows the employment pattern across different age cohorts over time. And if you look at the dark red column, you can see that the employment to population ratio for those in the 15 to 19 years bracket has fallen. And it's well documented that this age group experiences more adverse labour market outcomes than other age cohorts. Now, if you can draw your attention to the light pink column, what's interesting here is the decline in employment to population ratio for those 25 to 29 years of age since the last resources boom. This cohort had less labour market success since COVID hit as well. The right-hand side graph shows that there's evidence of a spatial pattern of employment over time. Part-time employment is more prevalent among younger age cohorts, such as 15 to 19 years old, and this is demonstrated by a concentration of the red dot at the top left-hand corner of the graph, and older cohorts, such as the 65 to 69-year-olds, and this is demonstrated by a concentration of yellow dots at the bottom corner of the right-hand side graph. So this may reflect young people engaging in full-time studying and part-time work, while older people are choosing part-time work or more casual arrangements as they transition to retirement. The consistency here of spatial patterns of employment by age suggests that any increase in demand for full-time or part-time workers will most likely be met by specific age cohorts. Now, drawing our attention to the overseas labour supply, what we've observed is that international and WA border restrictions have impacted the flow of overseas workers to WA. If I can draw your attention to the left-hand side graph, we can see the impact of border restrictions from the steep decline in the number of temporary and permanent migration numbers into WA. So, for example, the red line shows that the net gain in the number of migrants on a temporary visa in 2019 was close to 20,000, and this declined to less than 5,000 in 2020. As we've seen from media reports, this has had a major impact on the availability of workers for specific industries such as agriculture, accommodation, hospitality, and mining that typically rely on overseas workers. And this is demonstrated on the right-hand side graph, where there's a breakdown of net overseas migration by migration programs. And for example, if you look at the working holiday maker visa holders and international students in WA, this has shown a significant decline between 2019 and 2020. While the removal of international border restrictions, although WA's border remains, will alleviate some of the labour and skill shortages, it will take time for labour supply to build up and net overseas migration to get back to a level which is comparable prior to COVID. Going forward, the growth of net overseas migration to a level comparable to pre-COVID levels will be affected by a number of factors, such as WA's border restrictions and the Australian government's migration and border policy. This will include visa processing time, any changes to the permanent migration planning numbers, and for skill migration, changes to the migration occupation list and the eligibility criteria. With WA border restrictions remaining and only some international border restrictions being removed thus far, there are potential. The question then is, well, where are the potential workers that employers can draw on in the immediate and short term? One of the potential options is getting people who are working part-time into full-time employment. Of note is the employment patterns between men and women, which have been well documented with more men working in full-time jobs than women. If I can draw your attention to the concentration of light blue dots on the graph, you can see that there are more women working part-time, but would prefer to work more hours. So while underemployed workers are a poor potential workers that employers can access, it's important to match the skills of underemployed workers to the job, as well as ensuring flexibility in the job to entice participation of these workers. Another source of labour is migrants. Overseas workers have played an important role in the West Australian labour market. The two graphs shown here, the left-hand side graph shows the participation rate, and the right-hand side graph shows the unemployment rate of migrants by the length of time in Australia. As a summary, the graph suggests there's an adjustment effect for migrants who have arrived within the last 5 years, and I will refer to them as recently arrived migrants. Looking at the left-hand side graph, we can see that the participation rate among recently arrived migrants, which is the red line, is lower than that among migrants who have spent longer time in the country, particularly those who have spent between 5 and 14 years in Australia, which is evidenced by the two dark lines on top of the graph. On the right-hand side graph, we can see that the unemployment rate among recently arrived migrants, which is again the red line, is a lot higher than for migrants who have spent longer than 5 years in Australia. These migrants are already in Australia, so they're not subject to international border restrictions. However, some migrants face barriers, such as gaining relevant Australian work experience, obtaining registration and licensing required to work in certain occupations, and qualification recognitions. Hence, getting these workers settled and into jobs quickly can help resolve some of the skill and labour shortages. Another solution to alleviating immediate to short-term labour skill shortages is to reduce the transition from unemployment to employment, particularly among workers who have previous experience in industry and occupation that are in high demand. Looking at the left-hand side graph, we can see that the average job search duration for workers who previously worked in mining, professional, scientific and technical services, and retail trade sectors has increased since January 2020. If we focus now on the right-hand side graph, you can see that those who were previously employed in sale roles experienced even higher job search duration since January 2020. The challenge, therefore, is to get these workers into employment as quickly as possible. This will involve matching the job to the skills of the individuals and exploring how skills can be transferred across industries and occupations. Therefore, how skills are used is an important consideration for addressing skill shortages. This table shows that nationally, while most workers are working in jobs that align with their highest qualifications, there's a sizable proportion of workers who aren't. If I can draw your attention to the first column of numbers, you can see that WA is ranked 5th highest for those working in the field of their qualification at around 67.6%. And moving your attention now to the third column of numbers, you can see that WA is ranked 2nd highest for those who are working in jobs not relevant to their qualification at around 17.4%. But overall, the data are very similar across states and territories, suggesting that skills mismatch is not unique to WA. Now, some of the reason why workers are in jobs that don't match their skills include lack of positions available, they are comfortable in their current job, they're no longer interested in the field of their qualification, or they simply wanted a career change. Given these diverse reasons, there are challenges to match the current workforce to their skills. To sum up, what can we take away from FACTBase 78? Well, firstly, the data show that WA and Greater Perth have experienced strong growth in labour demand since 2020. And while COVID has accentuated labour and skill shortages, the data show a longer-term trend in demand. Potential solution could be increasing hours work among underemployed and reducing job search duration, particularly for those with experience in industries and occupation that are in high demand. Going forward, we need to understand how skills are used to facilitate skills transferability and enable labour mobility. While training and employing locals are essential, the overseas labour supply will remain important to fill the gap. So to wrap up, in this bulletin, I examined some of the challenges addressing immediate to short-term labour demand. It's vital that we understand what these challenges are in order to prepare the workforce to meet future demand. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for listening to FACTBase Talks. Our research is available on our website to download free of charge, and you will find this bulletin and other bulletins related to the future of work and all other areas that the Committee for Perth covers on Perth and its future available there.